The American Civil War. So one thing we need to remember here is the Civil War was the first 20th century war. Basically, it's an industrialized war, and it's going to be a war of attrition. So, choosing sides. Many military officers were forced to choose which side they would fight for. This meant some officers would have to fight against their home states and sometimes against their best friends, if not relatives. 1/3 of the total U.S. officers resigned and went to the Confederacy, including, most famously, Robert E. Lee. So one of the major military strengths for the South was they had strong military leadership. And as you see here, they have a strong tradition of military colleges in the South, because 7 out of 8 of them were in the South. So the North has a strong naval tradition. So advantages and disadvantages for each side. As you see here, the North had the economic advantage. They had the population advantage, 22 million people. They have more railroads. They have about 80% of all factories, and they have the money. The South, they have the experienced officers. They have 9 million people. However, 1/3 were slaves, not fighting. So you look at 6 million people, and then you start looking at women and children, and the number goes down from there. This means fewer people to work in their economy, especially during the war. South had to set up armories, and by 1862 they could meet their needs. So really, the John Brown failed attempt to raid Harper's Ferry will start setting up Southern military installations throughout the South. They could produce food, but they could not really distribute it well because they didn't have an extended network of railroads. So here are some resources for the Union and Confederacy. If you look at the chart here, it shows you the advantages for each side, really one side. So the Civil War begins. First shots were fired. One day after Lincoln's inauguration, Lincoln gets word that the Confederates demanded the immediate surrender of Fort Sumter, which was a major base in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, if Lincoln reinforces the fort, he'd be credited with starting the war. However, if he let the fort go to the Confederates, he'd been seen as recognizing the Confederates as a legitimate government. So if he did this, as you see, it'd weaken him in his own party, and it would have weakened his administration. So what would you do in this situation? Here's what Lincoln did. He only sent food and supplies to the troops, and he forces the South to declare war on the North. So he only supplies food and supplies to the troops. He doesn't send armaments. So he's not recognizing them as a legitimate government, and he's not weakening himself in his own party by not sending anything. So on April 12th, 1861 at 4:30 a.m., the Confederates fired first onto the Union Fort Sumter. 4,000 rounds of artillery were fired, and no one died. Major Robert Anderson, he, as the commander of Fort Sumter, he was forced to surrender. So the North and Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. This is a major concept you need to know, and this creates a national currency, and it allowed the governments to issue paper money for the first time. These were known as greenbacks because their backs were green. The Confederacy's financial situation was not good at all. It became worse over time. Southern banks were small and they had little reserves. Confederates had to tax their own people heavily. Confederates printed paper money, and this in turn increased inflation. Inflation in the South experienced a 9,000% increase in inflation compared to the North's 80%. So the South's money was completely worthless. Plus, the Union blockaded southern port cities and tried to tax trade, but the Union Navy, the naval blockades, they were not able to get their merchandise through consistently, so it's hard to tax, and especially, you're going to have smugglers in the South as well. So there's not going to be a lot of revenue coming into the Southern government and Southern leaders, political leadership. Southerners were then directly taxed by their own government. Many Southerners resented this tax and they refused to pay it. Basically, if you owned 20 slaves or more, you were not taxed. If you owned anything under 20 slaves, you had to pay this tax. So this is why it was known as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight in the South. So we get to Robert E. Lee and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln offers Robert E. Lee the task of heading up the Union Army on April 16th. However, Lee's going to turn him down because Robert E. Lee's home state will secede from the Union on the 17th. So Lincoln will go and make this a personal, make it a little personal here. And he actually takes Robert E. Lee's farm and plantation and uses it as a national burial site for all soldiers that were killed in the Washington area. It's called, anybody know the name of Robert E. Lee's home? It's called Arlington. It's where Arlington National Cemetery is. And Lincoln did this to remind Lee every day of what he had caused by not joining the Union side. However, Lee will never return to that house. So, moving on. Americans expect a short war. The Union strategy is really three-part, and it's known as the Anaconda Plan. It's the first 20th century war strategy. It comes complete with unconditional surrender and total warfare. These ideas, unconditional surrender and total warfare, will come along later in the war. But the Anaconda Plan is General Winfield Scott's plan, and he will be forced to resign when he tells Lincoln that he expects this war to last no shorter than 4 years. Lincoln asked for his resignation because Lincoln wanted this war over within a year. So if you think about it, how long did the war last? That's right, about 4 years. So, step number one. The Union's going to blockade southern ports, so the South couldn't export or import cotton or supplies that they needed. Move down the Mississippi River by land and by riverboat to split the Confederacy in half, and to capture the capital, basically the rival government. The Confederate strategy is a defensive strategy. They know the land, which is their biggest advantage, but it becomes a disadvantage in this 20th century war because of tearing the land up. The South had all of the great leadership and generals. The disadvantage is, once again, you're fighting in your backyard and it becomes a battlefield. The second part of their strategy is that when the opportunity allowed, they're going to fight in the north and they're going to try to capture Washington out of this, Washington, D.C. So the first battle after Fort Sumter was Bull Run, or Manassas, as the Union troops called it. It was a creek in Virginia about 25 miles from D.C. The South won the battle. The Union troops retreated to D.C. The Union was lucky not to lose the war because it was an unorganized retreat. The South got tired of following them back to D.C. because they run so fast back. The war could have been over after this, but many Southern troops actually returned home and felt this war would not be long because they said, if that's all the Union's got, I can go home. Stonewall Jackson, out of this battle, he gets the nickname Stonewall because of the way he basically gave orders out and kept us calm. George McClellan was placed in command of the Union Army's troops after Bull Run. And he took the task of running the Army of the Potomac. The Army of the Potomac is the nickname for the Northern Army. So, meanwhile, in Shiloh, out west, Tennessee, 1 month after his victories, Grant, in March of 1862, gathers up his troops to rest and await orders. However, he didn't entrench them, and he didn't send out scouts to look for the enemy. So on April 6th, the Confederates invaded and almost destroyed Grant's forces. On April 7th, the Confederates retreated, and there are two lessons learned from this. You always entrench your troops or dig a ditch, and you send out scouts to find out where your enemy is. And out of this, Grant will actually be demoted. So here is the first Bull Run. All right, so Commander David Farragut, he's about 60 years old at this time. He took control of New Orleans in 1862 with his fleet of 40 ships, about the same time Grant fought Shiloh in the spring of 62. The War of the Capitals. George McClellan proves to be a very cautious leader. His strength was in training soldiers, not strategy, so he's not going to be very aggressive either. He didn't want to fight until he had a force of 270,000 men. His army was already at 150,000. You're going to see a highlight here, the Battle of Antietam, August 29th and 30th of 1862 in Maryland. It's the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. It's a standoff. It's a one-day battle. We lose 26,000 men in 1 day of fighting. The Confederacy was hurt badly. However, McClellan doesn't pursue. How the Union troops found out the Confederates were in Maryland was a telegram that a private in the Union Army found, and the telegram was from Robert E. Lee, and it disclosed their location. So the Confederacy out of this is hurt very badly. If McClellan would have pursued Lee, he would have had free rein down to Richmond, and he could have ended the war. He did not, so Lincoln will end up firing him. This is important. This is important as well. Britain remains neutral. The South is looking for an ally, and Britain actually was trading cotton and supplies with the South during the Civil War. So what happens here? If Britain enters the war, the North is going to lose its advantages in naval capability and military capability and industrial capability. So Lincoln knows this is a tricky situation here. So the Trent Incident happens. The Confederacy is trying to get help from Britain. Two Confederate ambassadors, John Slidell and James Mason, were traveling on the Trent. Charles Wilkes of the USS San Jacinto arrested Slidell and Mason. Britain threatens to go to war with the U.S. They threaten to enter the war. So what is Lincoln's response? In September of 1862, he's going to write the Emancipation Proclamation. He's going to emancipate the slaves. It's not going to become official until January 1st of 1863, and this is an ingenious political move, and we'll talk about that coming up. The Alabama claims. Britain did supply the South with supplies to fight with, including ships. The CMS or the CSA Alabama sunk 64 Union ships before it was sank. And the U.S. would bill Britain $19 million for this. Britain ignores this until 1872, and then they paid $15.5 million in war damages. So Lincoln's view of slavery, he doesn't like it. He doesn't like slavery, but he felt the federal government didn't have the power to abolish it either. Not where it already existed. Not one time does he ever mention ending slavery in the South, but Southerners feared that he could just simply pass a law. Remember, Lincoln is a constitutional lawyer, and he believes that slavery was protected by the Fifth Amendment property rights, so he was not going to do that. He just wanted to end it out west, where the states had not been, the territories had not become states yet. So his goal was always to preserve the Union. He felt that emancipating the slaves would best meet his goal morally and politically. On January 1st, 1863, he issues this, and it serves three purposes. Purpose number one is it would discourage Britain from entering on the South side. Once again, if Britain did enter this war, we lose our advantages in the Union. So he did not. That was the first and foremost thing that he saw. We got to keep Britain out of this war. And why wouldn't Britain fight? Because they ended slavery in 1833. So if you change the focus of the war and make it more about slavery, Britain couldn't join fighting for a slave cause. It would free blacks in the North who would now enlist and fight, giving the North a distinct advantage in manpower. It freed the blacks in the South once the Union troops took over that area. It doesn't free all slaves. It frees slaves behind Union lines. So the reactions to emancipation, free blacks, of course, welcomed it. Democrats said that this would antagonize the South and it would extend the war. And as you see, they would see this as a change of life for them. So they would fight to the death. And they were right for this. Because once again, if you free slaves, they've proven with Nat Turner's rebellion that they're going to kill whites and all that good stuff. It was just a huge paranoia. The North as a whole now had to win this war completely. So we'll pick up with this on the next PowerPoint or on the next screencast.